Previously in Chronicles, going back to Jehoshaphat, he made an ill-advised alliance with Ahab, the king of the north. He married his son Jehoram to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Jehoram goes the way of the kings of the north and murders his own family members to secure his throne. Through a series of divine punishments, Athaliah loses her husband and sons and ends up taking the throne for herself. Through all of this, she never relents or repents. She continues her apostasy and continues destroying the house of David. Her grandson, Joash, the last remaining rightful heir to the throne, in a story reminiscent of Moses, is saved from infanticide by the tyrant's family member. He remains hidden until he can be installed as king. In the 7th year, Jehoiada, the chief priest, leads a coup to install the child king and executes Athaliah for her treason. We jump forward some time. Joash is now apparently an adult. We'll pick up with the first verses of chapter 24. And so the first couple of verses read, Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebiah of Beersheba. And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. And many commentators take this fact that he had multiple wives here as something of a concession, that he needs to rebuild the house. So he has multiple wives, but he doesn't quite go all the way to the excesses of Rehoboam or Abijah. But already in verse 2, we're getting this foreshadowing that Joash does what's right in the eyes of the Lord as long as Jehoiada, the priest, is there with him. And that's going to continue throughout this narrative. Verses 4 through 10 are kind of difficult. And so I've tried to summarize all the nuts and bolts type issues for us. I tried to timestamp these videos so you can move around if need be. But as a quick summary of this section, Joash decides to restore the temple in verse 4. He then instructs the priests and the Levites to go out and gather money from the cities of Judah, but they fail to act quickly. Joash summons Jehoiada. He asks him why he hasn't required the Levites to bring in the Mosaic tax of Exodus 30, 12 through 16. Joash commands a box to be made and makes a proclamation that the people are to bring the tax to the temple in verses 8 through 10. And so that's roughly this section. But as I continue, there are questions about the sequence of events here. A straightforward reading appears to censure Jehoiada and the priests, a sentiment that seems inconsistent with Chronicles' themes. So usually the priests and the Levites are viewed very positively. Well, here they're critiqued. So that would seem to be at odds, but of course, Chronicles elsewhere has no problem criticizing its own heroes. For example, 1 Chronicles 21 with David, and it should be noted that the tax David failed to take in 1 Chronicles 21 is the tax the chronicler seems to be referring to here. And there are going to be other hooks back into 1 Chronicles 21. Now, in the notes here, I've written something almost like a mini article that goes through the different ways that this is looked at. For our purposes here, there is something of a heightened emphasis on that Exodus 30 legislation or tax. And so either way, you have in verse 6 this question of, well, why haven't you conducted the Moses tax? Because that tax is specifically for the upkeep of the tent of testimony. So that would make sense. Well, let's use that tax to renovate the temple that has fallen into shambles because of the previous generations. And it should also be noted in this section here that the tent of testimony is our term here, a duth that we saw in the last chapter. And in verse 7, when it speaks of why they need to renovate, for the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the house of God and had also used all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord for the Baals. What's very interesting is this language here of Athaliah, that wicked woman, as Selman notes in his commentary. Athaliah, who is not mentioned in 2 Kings 12, is really described as the embodiment of wickedness, since this description is remarkably similar to that found in one of Zechariah's visions. This may well be another example of the chronicler's use of prophetic imagery. And this vision is very interesting. He doesn't give the verse reference, but he's referring to the woman in the basket. I think it's Zechariah 5, the flying basket, which is like an anti-Ark of the Covenant image. It's really interesting. And perhaps also worth pointing out that this chest or box that the king eventually has made is our term aron, which is sometimes used of the Ark of the Covenant. In fact, I have a note on this here from Lightheart. So after he gives this proclamation that they're to make this chest, the people are to bring in the offerings, the people rejoice and they do so. And Lightheart writes of this, the Levites complete the collection in verse 10, here translated as finished, so that the carpenters and craftsmen can complete the work in verse 14. The chronicler used the same verb to describe the completion of the temple in 2 Chronicles 5:1 and 7:1, and it alludes to Yahweh's completion of the creation in Genesis 2:1 through 4. By maintaining the temple, Joash is engaged in world maintenance, world completion, and world glorification. And this is also worth bringing up earlier in this section, the tax levied by Moses. And this is literally more something like burden. But Johnstone writes, it is striking that the words for duties and enlistment in Exodus 30:12 come from the same root, PQD, as the words for the king's supervision and the official of the chief priest, which are used in the immediate context in 2 Chronicles 24:11. So it's just pointing out an additional connection between this section and Exodus 30. The payment is to avert any plague in Exodus 30, any possible punitive action against the people because they are being numbered. And then he says, compare the presumptuousness of an improperly conducted census, now familiar from 1 Chronicles 21, where the root PQD occurs in verse 5, and the stain of the plague of the negative Passover at Ornan's threshing floor in verses 9 through 17. So we saw he forgot to take this Exodus 30 tax. He just numbered them. So he took a military census without paying the tax, and that resulted in this plague. And so you have a number of or as he puts it, negative Passover themes. And we've seen that a number of times in this section. We've seen both positive, where the enemies of God are destroyed or they're struck down. But then we've seen at times where the Passover hits Israel and Judah because of their sin. So consistently, the enemies of the Lord are being hit by these Passovers. It's just sometimes Judah is the recipient of the blessing of that, and sometimes they're in the crosshairs of that Passover. And so just more of this vocabulary is bringing back to mind David's failed census in 1 Chronicles. But Johnstone continues, the temple thus maintained. So after paying this tax, they're now able to upkeep the temple, and it becomes the visible expression of the petition by the people for the sparing of their lives and of the acceptance by God of that petition. And I also have this note here from Klein. He had a footnote concerning this language, Moses, the servant of the Lord. And he points out that Moses is called servant of Yahweh 16 other times. Once in Deuteronomy, 14 in Joshua, and once in 2 Kings. Often Chronicles is put at the end of Old Testament collections. That's really interesting because this would be the 17th and final time that Moses is called the servant of Yahweh. And if you followed along, as Labuschagne argues, 17 and 26, both divine numbers, the value of the divine name Yahweh. Chronicles has more occurrences of those numbers than any other book. And so it may be coincidental, but maybe intentional to draw that number of times Moses is referred to as the servant of Yahweh to 17 exact times throughout the Old Testament. And so the people joyfully bring in their tax to renovate the temple. And they did so day after day, and they collected money in abundance. And with this money, they hire masons, carpenters, metal workers to restore the house of the Lord, which itself is a callback to the original construction of the temple. A lot of the same language, the work of the house of the Lord, these kinds of things are bringing back to mind the original. creation of the temple. And so they renovate the temple, and with the leftover money, they're going to again make the utensils for the burnt offerings, the dishes and incense bowls, vessels of silver and gold. And at the end of verse 14, we have, and they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord regularly all the days of Jehoiada. Again, we have that ominous note that as long as Jehoiada's around, things were going well. And on that note, we move down to a new section in verse 15. It's a paragraph break in the Masoretic text. But Jehoiada grew old and full of days, and he died. He was 130 years old at his death, and they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel and toward God and his house. And this language of doing good has been one of our key terms. And I write here that Jehoiada has been a kingly figure throughout the narrative. He takes courage, he makes a covenant, he makes reforms, and when he dies, he's buried among the kings. He foreshadows the blurring of king priest in Zechariah 6 and ultimately in Christ. And Johnstone says the prodigious length of his life, surpassing even the 120 years of Moses, is testimony to a superabundance of blessing. The unique blessing is matched by the unique regard in which he is held. Alone of the commoners in Chronicles, he receives burial in the royal tombs in Jerusalem. And remember, some of the kings themselves don't get this honor. It is not simply that he had married into the royal house. He is himself virtually a royal figure. His honorific burial is richly deserved through his actions in his own right. It was he who had kept the faint flicker of the Davidic house and of the Lord's worship alive through the dark days of Athaliah's usurpation. It was he who organized the successful coup against Athaliah that brought about the restoration of the Davidic house and of the temple. So he restores both houses. And it's also, again, another ominous note that he is buried among the kings, because that will become relevant immediately hereafter. Because we pick up in verse 17, now after the death of Jehoiada, the princes of Judah came and paid homage to the king, or literally prostrated themselves. Then the king listened to them. He shamas the princes, and they abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and served the Asherim and the idols. And wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this guilt of theirs. Yet he sent prophets among them to bring them back to the Lord. These testified against them, but they would not pay attention. So immediately after Jehoiada dies, the king is going to fall into apostasy. And again, we have this key language of wrath and guilt. Remember, we saw this before, where it called back to the king's account. You would have to check out that video. But we'll pick up with Lightheart in his commentary. He says, while Jehoiada is alive, Joash turns his ear to him. Now that the priest's voice is silent, the king hears, Shema, the voice of the officials, and abandons the house that he has spent his reign repairing and restoring. Forsaking Yahweh, the people serve the Asherim and idols, and their asham, guilt, provokes Yahweh's wrath. Joash forgets that Yahweh responds to abandonment by abandonment. If you forsake me, I will forsake you. Forsake is used 5 times in the passage. So it's going to become a key term here in chapter 24. And picking up with Johnstone, he says, together, king and nobility reject the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers. Reject is Chronicles' key term for depriving of God of what is due to him. What has been rejected is succinctly but comprehensively stated: the temple with all its symbolism of the cosmic reign of God, the personal relationship with God under the name the Lord, by which he is known to Israel, and the tradition handed down from the fathers, David and Moses. In immediate terms, all that Jehoiada has risked his life for, all that Joash himself has been preserved for, and all that Joash has hitherto accomplished is forfeited. Those in leadership in the community revert not just to the ways of the house of Ahab, but to the condition of the time of Saul, to the worship of the Asherim, the wooden posts symbolic of Canaanite female deity, and the idols. And he points out that the only other occurrence of the word in Chronicles is in 1 Chronicles 10:9 in relation to Saul's defeat by the Philistines, that ever-present lurking alien force. And so Saul's ma'al, his refusal to seek the Lord, is kind of the standard that Chronicles keeps going back to, as here's what you don't do. And now that language suddenly starts popping up. Even though everything was going great with Joash as long as Jehoiada was around, now he's immediately become Saul all over again. And though the Lord sends them prophets, they don't listen. And picking up in verse 20, then the Spirit of God clothed Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, Thus says the Lord, why do you break the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you. But they conspired against him, and by command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash, the king, did not remember the kindness, the chesed, that Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, had shown him, but killed his son. And when he was dying, he said, May the Lord see and avenge. And we'll pick up here with Johnstone concerning this Spirit of God clothing him language. This is one of the standard expressions for enrapture by inspiration, already in 1 Chronicles 12:8, where again, it is no professional prophet who is involved, but a layperson who has been actively engaged in events. Zechariah takes his stand on some eminence, that is, he stood above. The vocabulary recalls the location of Abijah's address of a prophet to the north in 2 Chronicles 13:4, or of Jehoshaphat to his army in 2 Chronicles 20:20. Might it, with great irony, be the very spot where Joash himself had once stood in full view of the people to be acknowledged as king? And he says, compared to the place he is stoned. If you recall, if you saw the previous video when he was installed, it mentions that he was standing by the pillar of the king, or something to that effect. And I pointed out how most commentators take that as a reference to Jacob and Boaz, these two freestanding pillars outside of the temple. But Johnstone argued rather than standing next to a pillar, he was standing on some kind of platform. And so if he was right about that, that would be rather interesting here, because it is possible then that Zechariah stood on this platform and addressed the people. But picking up with Lightheart, he writes, he charges Joash with passing over the Lord's commands, and his warning is identical to Azariah's in 2 Chronicles 15:1-7. You have forsaken the Lord, so he has forsaken you. Joash responds like Asa and Ahab and conspires to silence the prophet. The king, who had been careful not to put Athaliah to death in the temple, arranges for the prophet to be stoned in the court of the house of Yahweh. Zechariah dies with the martyr's plea on his lips. May Yahweh see and avenge. His very name, Yah remembers, is assurance that the prayer will be heard. Joash's sin is compounded because it is a sin against Jehoiada's chesed, his faithfulness. And similarly, picking up, Johnstone says, it is he himself who gives the order for conspiracy against Zechariah. So that is the king. This is yet another irony, as he had come to the throne by conspiracy against Athaliah. So he now rids himself by conspiracy of the support that had brought him to the throne. He is himself to be the target of conspiracy in verse 25. So you have layers of conspiracy going on. But he continues, the ironies mount with the outrages. Though on his ascension, care was taken not to pollute the temple with the blood of the wicked Athaliah. Now by Joash's order, Zechariah is murdered in the temple where he officiates as priest. The fate that had been meted out to Matan, the priest of Baal, is now meted out to the son of the chief priest of the Lord in his own sanctuary. The act was no doubt intentional. Joash, having abandoned the temple of the Lord, now wished to pollute it and thus make it unfit for worship. The means of the murder by stoning implies that it was a judicial act undertaken by the whole community, an act of judicial murder. And so now Joash has completely led the people of Judah into outright apostasy. And it should be noted, by the way, that this figures into the New Testament, possibly, when Jesus in Matthew refers to Abel to Zechariah. It's possible he's referencing this because in some collections of the Old Testament, obviously that would mean Genesis to the end, the book of Chronicles, the way we might say Genesis to Revelation. But some manuscripts in Matthew do actually say Zechariah, son of Berechiah, which is the Zechariah, the one that has the book. And then there are other candidates as well, but he may potentially be referring to this particular episode. And so that reference to the son of Berechiah might be some later insertion by a scribe or something. And back to Johnstone, he says, the incident closes with a grim inclusio. Joash did not remember, verse 22, picks up Zechariah's own name, the Lord has remembered. What man conveniently forgets, the Lord notes. Zechariah dies with such an appeal on his lips in words of ominous import. May the Lord see and may he exact. May the Lord see picks up the association of the sacrifice of Isaac at the sanctuary on Mount Moriah, where the temple now stands, which Abraham had called, the Lord will see, Jehovah Jireh. Of course, what's interesting is this location is the temple site, which is picked up again in 1 Chronicles 21, David's failed census. They see the angel of the Lord over this threshing floor. That site is chosen, becomes the temple site. 2 Chronicles 3:1 specifically tells us this is Mount Moriah. And so this ties all of this stuff back together. But back to Johnstone, he says, the phrase, may the Lord exact, picks up precisely the key word, DRS, darash, which is like seek. That's usually how it's translated. Now used in an awesome sacramental sense. Those who do not seek are by that act themselves sought out. So as I said earlier, Saul is like the quintessential apostate in a way in Chronicles because he failed to seek the Lord. He sought guidance from the help of other spirits. And so when Zechariah says, may the Lord see and avenge, again, it's this word usually translated elsewhere as seek. But very interesting. This could almost be like the tagline for the book of Chronicles. Those who do not seek are by that act themselves sought out. So either you seek the Lord and receive the blessing, or you reject the Lord and you yourself are sought out for punishment. But moving on, spoiler alert, Joash assassinated. By the way, I did have this note that I thought was kind of interesting. So the two prior sections in chapter 24 are structured around the number 17. So verses 1 through 14 are 14 times 17 words. And then verses 15 through 22 are 7 times 17 words. And also of note in that entire section, verses 1 through 22, which are structured off in the Masoretic text, the divine number, or rather the divine name, which numbers 17 or 26, is used itself 17 times in this section. So there is a strong link in that previous section. And then here we get to a new section where Joash is assassinated. Itself not structured by 17s. But we pick up in verse 23. At the end of the year, the army of the Syrians came up against Joash. They came to Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the princes of the people from among the people, and sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus. Though the army of the Syrians had come with few men, the Lord delivered into their hand a very great army, because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. Thus they executed judgment on Joash. And we'll stop there, because there are these Exodus motifs. Again, we're back to the Passover type of language. And so Johnstone says the negative Passover motif is again employed in the judgments that are enacted against Joash in verse 24. Judgments picks up the Lord's demonstrations of power against Egypt and the gods of Egypt in Exodus 6:6, 7:4, and 12:12. And through this, as well as the fact that the Syrians, it says, came with a few men. So they had a smaller army, but they defeat the larger army of Judah. Again, this is what happens to the enemies of the Lord. They are destroyed, even if they are superior in the eyes of man. And so turning to other gods and killing the priests, they've turned their back on the Lord and are now the recipients of these judgments. And then down to verse 25, When they had departed from him, leaving him severely wounded, his servants conspired against him because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest, and killed him on his bed. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. And then it's going to break off into the biographical details to conclude his reign. And it also actually has a unique occurrence of the term midrash here. But we'll pick back up with Lightheart. He says, Yahweh sends the Arameans to kill the royal officials and capture Jerusalem, the same Arameans that Asa funded. Joash's own servants conspire and murder him on his bed, forming an ironic conclusion to the story of a king who was originally rescued from a conspiracy by being placed in a bed. Remember, he was put in this inner bedchamber, however that's translated. It's the same term. The chronicler tells us that the conspirators acted to avenge the blood of Zechariah, and they refused to bury Joash's body with the other kings. Of course, also, Jehoiada the priest was buried there, but the king doesn't get buried among the kings. For all his achievements, Joash's end is pathetic because it is rebellious. And Johnstone points out that it is the nobles who are singled out here in this section. They are the ones who had prostrated themselves to Joash in verse 17. They paid homage or whatever. And they had been instrumental in leading him astray. But the common people have to suffer the loss of status as a people with them. As in the case of Saul, no man dies to himself, let alone a misguided aristocracy. I thought that's well put. The people often suffer with their rulers. This happens even in the modern era. But given the judicial act of stoning Zechariah previously, it's tough to know how involved the laity, the normal person, would have been, how complicit they would have been with this apostasy. But either way, they suffer the consequences of their leaders. But that is going to be the sad end to the reign of Joash. And his son Amaziah is going to reign in his place. But we will pick that up next time.